What We Pretend We Can't See by Gyzym, read by LMX Mabella. Epilogue. 3 months after his showdown with Stockholm, Harry steps across the threshold of Auror headquarters and knows abruptly that he can't work there anymore. It's not that much of a surprise, really. He's been talking around it with Draco for weeks, over dinner or during lazy mornings in bed. The fact that he only ever got into this line of work because he thought it was what he was supposed to do, because he couldn't picture himself doing anything else. Draco's done a lot of eye-rolling and jabbing him in the chest and calling him an idiot about the whole thing, but he hasn't actually come out and said that he thinks Harry should quit. Harry's not certain, but he thinks it's a conclusion Draco wants him to draw for himself, either for Harry's mental health or because Draco doesn't want to be held responsible for any consequences. There was that one night, though, when Harry came home shaken and covered in blood, too angry and heartbroken at what he'd seen, but he hadn't managed to stop, to even say anything to Draco other than, "I'm fine, it's not my blood," and, "No, I don't want to fucking talk about it." He got in the shower and tried to no avail to scrub himself clean of the experience, and after a while Draco climbed in behind him, hooked an arm around Harry's waist, his chin over Harry's shoulder. "You don't have to do this to yourself, you know," Draco said, barely audible over the sound of spray. "There are plenty of people who even enjoy their jobs. I enjoy my job. I think Blaze would make sweet love to his job if it were possible." Harry bowed his head, the water beating a steady, shimmering pattern against the back of his neck. "Blaze is a sick man," he said, because it was always worth saying before miserable, he continued, "But I have an obligation, you know, to those people, to everyone. I have to fight and defend them. I can't just run out on that because I don't enjoy it or whatever." After a long moment of silence and in a strange voice, Draco said, "Good Lord, Harry, don't you ever get tired of mattering yourself? I have an obligation to all people in any kind of distress. Honestly." "What?" Harry said, and Draco calmly reached up a hand and redirected the spray of the shower directly into Harry's face, the obnoxious little fuck. "I've got this theory," Draco said, all innocent, earnest interest as Harry spluttered, "that you actually don't hear yourself when you talk. I've decided that every time you open your mouth, all that registers for you is, well, I don't know, I haven't worked this bit out yet, a duck quacking or something. In any case, it's clearly less theory than fact, because if you could hear what you sounded like just now, I have full faith that you'd known it for the utter nonsense it was." He dug his sharp chin into the meat of Harry's shoulder, a punishing little gesture. "You deserve to be happy, you know, even if you are the most tragically irritating person under the sun." Harry didn't really believe him or anything, but he turned around to press Draco against the cool, damp tile and kiss him just for saying it, just for seeming to think that it was true. Draco opened his mouth against Harry's, and with one thing and another they never worked their way back around to the topic. But he's carried Draco's words in his pocket since he heard them all the same, a talisman of sorts. You deserve to be happy. It's a strange thought. Still, that's not even what does it. The morning he walks into the office and knows in his bones that he's not cut out to be an Auror anymore. It's not though he thinks, "Well, this doesn't make me happy, and it never did, and therefore I must go, because I deserve happiness, Draco said so," or anything silly like that. It's more that he looks out at the hive of activity bossing around him and is struck wholly and without reservation with the realization that he doesn't know where he fits into it anymore. That maybe he's never known. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't stop to think it through. He just walks into Erhard's office, crosses his arms over his chest, and said, "So, I think I quit." Erhard raises her eyebrows, and after a second spells the door shut and mirrors his posture, leaning back over her crossed arms to regard him. "You think you quit?" Harry says again. He shifts a little under her scrutiny, even as his resolve firms up. "Like, I quit, I mean. I guess people don't just leave, do they?" 2 weeks' notice is their customary courtesy," Erhard says, and Harry's surprised to notice a slight smile slip onto her face. "Have you ever actually quit a job before, Auror Potter?" "No," Harry admits. He runs a hand through his hair and offers her a rueful shrug. I've never quit, well, much of anything, really. Sorry? Erhard's not. Don't apologize to me. I have no interest in keeping anyone on staff who doesn't want to be here, to be entirely honest with you. She trails off, and the rare expression of uncertainty on her face is so pronounced that Harry can't help but laugh. I'm not very good at it, am I? Harry says. He doesn't really need to hear the answer. He knows it's the truth. Erhard gives him an evaluative look, steepling her fingers. I think that's a little harsh. In some aspects of the position, you're one of our strongest auras, but in other... Tactical decision-making? Harry says lightly. This conversation should be embarrassing, but weirdly, it's kind of a relief. Waiting for backup, following orders, doing any paperwork at all. You do at least seem to know your weaknesses, Erhard says, the smile stealing back onto her face. Which is more than I can say for some of your colleagues. She leans forward, rests her now folded hands on her desk. May I ask what prompts this abrupt exit? Have you been snapped up by another department, perhaps? Going to work with Granger and Justice. Good, Harry says, laughing on it a little, before he realizes it's a serious question. Oh, no, ma'am. I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to do next, to be honest with you. Just something else. No offense. He adds a little awkwardly when she raises her eyebrows. I'll admit, Potter, I had you packed for a ministry lifer. Erhard says, shaking her head. But what can you do? Start organizing your active cases for transfer, and we'll announce it to the press on Monday. He holds up a hand before Harry can protest, but there is no reason to involve the papers, and he doesn't know why she would insist on calling them. You're a public figure, whether you like it or not, Harry Potter. It's a smart thing to do, for you and for the department. Fine, Harry mutters, wondering if he can't figure out a way to be conveniently held at one point that day for old time's sake. Erhard surprises him and laughs. I'll tell you one thing I will not miss. That look on your face. The migraine that always goes with it, either. Get out of my office, and whatever you're thinking about doing on Monday, forget it. One last favor to the old boss before you go. Yeah, all right, Harry says, grinning now. He feels lighter as he stands and walks to the door. Guilty, too, already, and afraid to even consider what the prophet might write about it, but lighter all the same. Oh, and Potter? Harry turns, Erhard straightens in her seat, lifts her jaw. Thank you for your service. Harry says, startled and touched. You too? And flees to his desk before he has to deal with any further sincerity. He keeps his head down for the rest of the day, not ready to say anything to anyone, and when he gets home he remembers that it's Wednesday and Ron, Hermione and Rose are coming for dinner. It's a thing they do pretty regularly now. Him and Draco have people over. Invite friends to their shared space. It's nice. Harry's getting used to it. Draco's not home yet, but dinner, as always, is at 7, so Harry shrugs and starts cooking, losing himself a little in the process. When Draco bursts through the door at 10 minutes till, sweaty from the summer heat and enraged about some meeting with an antiquities dealer in Sussex, Harry honestly forgets to tell him. He leaves his pots and pans working on the stove and follows Draco upstairs instead. Leans against the doorway of their bedroom while Draco changes his shirt and rants. And then, Harry, then, he says, Oh, I don't know about that, Mr. Malfoy. I've got another buyer offering me fair market value. Like I don't know what fair market value is for an 18th century amulet that never even worked in the first place. And it's all so comfortable that Harry doesn't think about the big life-changing decision he just made. Just hums vague agreement where he thinks he's supposed to, and watches Draco's hands, which are flying around in agitation, even as he does up the buttons of his shirt, making the whole process agonizingly slow. It's still a little weird for Harry, if he's honest, to look at this room that was once Draco's, and acknowledge that it's now his, too. It's not like it's really a new thing, even though they both agreed that it would be insane to move in together straight off the bat. In practice, Harry's lived here since he decided to stay temporarily during the case, and they both know it. Hell, Harry's only slept a handful of nights in his own apartment in the last 3 months, and a few of them were just to prove that he could, and the other one barely counts anyway. It wasn't even a full night. He and Draco had an enormous row about Hagrid, of all things, and then Draco turned up at 4 in the morning to, essentially, needle Harry into bullying him to apologize, so Harry's lived here for a while, is the truth. Harry supposes, as he watches Draco do up his last button, that it's a bit like the hole that used to be in the perfectly solid wall Draco's standing in front of. It took weeks to knit itself back together, slow, painstaking work that Draco tracked with a little frown and a ruler, and Harry bets it feels a bit strange sometimes too, standing there whole as if it was never in pieces. He smiles at Draco, who fixes things up as a hobby, who loves this mad old house he rescued and that mad old plant he rescued, and maybe even mad old Harry, who he rescued a little bit too. Some days Harry thinks Draco has a lot of nerve accusing him of having a savior complex, since, if anything, he's worse. He's just a lot more selective about it. Draco catches him looking and flushes. Still, his voice is lofty and dignified when he says, "Stop oogling me, Potter. Your friends will be here any minute with their child, no less, and I'm sure they'd all be scarred for life if they walked in on anything risque." "Oh, because they're going to come up to the bathroom looking for us," Harry says, rolling his eyes. "And they're your friends too, Draco." "Bite your tongue," Draco says. Though Harry knows it's mostly for show. "It's bad enough that I associate with you. You and Ron went and got a drink last week," Harry says in the triumphant tones of a man with an ace up his sleeve. "That's true friendship, that is." "It was only because you and Hermione were late," says Draco, looking hunted. "No fun was had, no camaraderie was forged. Ron said you had a lovely time," Harry says wickedly. "I believe his exact words were, 'That helpful, that Malfoy.'" Draco shudders. "That's truly horrible, Harry. Thank you. My day was going too well, you see. Without you to bring me down, I might have spent the whole night doing something as hideous as enjoying myself." "Something one does," Harry says mildly, "with one's friends." He attempts Draco's signature solo eyebrow raise too, but he's not sure that it's really working all that well. After struggling to hold a scowl for about 2 seconds, Draco snorts with laughter and shakes his head. "You look deranged. I mean, you are deranged, so it's fitting at least, but—" They lose whatever he was about to say to Kreacher appearing with his customary crack. Though it drove him a bit mad at first, Harry has grown to love that crack. It's very helpful in delicate situations, and has saved him from accidentally exposing himself more than once.
"The Weasleys are here, Master Draco and Harry Potter,"
Kreacher trills, even as Harry sighs. He's categorically forbidden Kreacher from calling him Master Harry, Master Potter, or anything else involving the word master. On the theory that it really is Draco's house, whatever it might have decided, and also the idea of answering to master makes him uncomfortable anyway. Kreacher agreed easily enough, but could not be swayed into calling him either Harry, Harry's preference, or Potter, Draco's. So Harry seems to be stuck with his full name for the duration. "Thanks, Kreacher," Harry says instead of fighting that losing battle again. He and Draco go downstairs, still bickering about whether or not Ron and Hermione are Draco's friends, though Harry knows with some amusement that Draco abandons the topic the minute they're in earshot. They have drinks in the kitchen while Harry finishes making dinner and Draco plays with Rose, and all in all, it's not until about halfway through the meal that Harry remembers that he has an important piece of information to share. He braces himself. "So," Harry says, keeping his voice casual and his eyes on his plate, when there's a lull following an impassioned discussion of Hermione's last official ruling. I quit my job today." His admission is followed by dead silence. He doesn't dare to look up. Ron's the first to break. You did what?" "Oh, Harry," Hermione says, sounding despairing. "But you've put in so much time there. You couldn't have been more than a year or two out for a promotion." "I didn't want a promotion," Harry says to his piece. "I'd have had to give up the field work, and that's the only part of the job I've ever even sort of liked." "Well, that's not true," Ron says at once. "You like, well, okay, maybe not most of the paperwork and networking and stuff, but still, you could have found a way to, I don't know, work around that, something." He lowers his voice conspiratorially. "You know, I haven't even heard any whispering about this among the senior staff. I bet you still have time to change your mind." "I don't want to change my mind," Harry tells his remaining bites of rosemary-crusted lamb, defiant for all he's not making eye contact with anyone. And I'm not going to, anyway. It's done. Silence blooms out between them again, unbroken except for the sound of Rose merrily thwapping her spoon against the side of the table, and Harry can't take it any more. He lifts his head and looks at Draco. Draco is looking back at him, eyes warm, smile small, and honest, and so pleased that Harry can't help but grin back awash with relief. "Well, Potter, took you long enough." "Good," Harry says, so affectionate that Draco winces a little, though he doesn't quit smiling. "Oh no," says Ron, looking back and forth between them. "Don't tell me you support this, Malfoy. It's one of your schemes." "Sorry to disappoint, Weasley," and Draco says, though his eyes don't leave Harry's for a second. If Harry didn't know any better, he'd say Draco sounded almost proud. "I'm afraid this was all Harry's doing." "What made?" Ron says. His voice is so entreating that Harry forces his gaze away from Draco to glance at him and regrets it immediately. Ron's face has fallen dramatically, and Harry feels a swell of guilt at his wounded look. "We were going to work together until we were old. We were going to be those guys, you know, who'd been there forever, and the junior Aurors would come in and say, 'Who are those guys?' And everyone laughed and said, 'Oh, them, that's Potter and Weasley. They've been here since the dawn of time.'" Harry has a wild, angry moment, just for a second, thinking of that night in Ron and Hermione's dining room, months and months ago. He'd gone over there so sure that he was going to beg Ron not to take his promotion, and then he saw how happy Ron was, and he bit his tongue. And it's not fair, the situation's not the same, but for a second he wants to take Ron's hat off anyway. Hermione too. Can just see himself screaming, "Don't you want me to be happy?" Even though he's not entirely sure he knows the answer to that question himself. Even though he wants to believe that isn't why he's done this, because it doesn't seem like a good enough reason somehow. "That is such a grim dream. I may drink my own tears with dessert," says Draco, before Harry can say anything. "Harry, will my tears go well with whatever you've made?" "Victoria sponge with raspberries. No," Harry says, grateful for the distraction, "but I can do you a quick cheese plate if you like." Draco's shoulders shake a little with suppressed laughter, though his voice is sarcastic when he says, "Truly, your mastery of the culinary arts astound me. A cheese plate? What insight? What vision?" "Look, if you want to drink a cup of tears with cake, be my guest," Harry says, not bothering to hide his amusement all that much. "Choke on it for all I care." "Maybe I will, Potter," Draco says, with a slight leer. He leans forward on his elbows a bit. "Do you think?" "Oh my God," says Ron abruptly, reminding Harry, and Draco judging by his little jump, that he's still there. Thankfully, having forgotten him makes it a bit difficult to hold on to his anger vis-à-vis Ron not paying enough attention to Harry's whatever emotional state. "First of all, let's spare baby Rose to floor show." "And her mother too," Hermione says, patting the now visible swell of little possibly Violet, possibly Hugo. "I'm fragile, you know, in the family way. You might overwhelm my delicate sensibilities and kill me right here at this table." "Hermione, the first half of tonight's dinner conversation featured a story about you telling two clerks what they could shove their inaccurate reports," Harry says, raising his eyebrows. "Fragile and delicate aren't really the words that come to mind." "Well," Hermione says, popping a cherry tomato in her mouth and not having the grace to look even slightly moved. "Still, getting back to the matter at hand," Ron says pointedly, maybe it was a little unrealistic, okay, to think that you and me would just, work together forever or whatever, but mate, what are you even going to do now?" "Yes, Harry," Hermione says, leaning forward to regard him with interest. "If not the Aurors, then what? Ooh, you're thinking of going back to get your newts, are you? I know it's a bit late, but I think it's a great idea. I always said you'd wish you had them someday." When Harry throws another look to Draco, feeling hunted, Draco's staring back at him, still wearing that small, honest smile. Eyes glittering, he says, "Let me guess, you decided to do it, about 12 seconds before you actually did, didn't you? And of course you didn't bother to think it through any further than that, so you have no earthly idea what you're going to do now. Does that sound about right?" Harry winces and shrugs a shoulder. Well, more or less." "Harry!" Hermione groans, even as Ron drops his hat into his hands. But Draco tips his head back and laughs, the sound low and rich, filling the room. He's not laughing at Harry exactly. Harry, for better or worse, is very familiar with that particular sound, and there's no hint of mockery to it, no sharp edges on which to cut himself. He seems more delighted than anything else, like Harry is so wildly entertaining that Draco can't help but bubble over with it a little. It warms Harry to his toes.
"Oh, Potter,"
Draco says, shaking his head, voice still thready with laughter.
"You are who you are, aren't you?"
Harry shrugs again. "I guess so."
"Incredible,"
Draco says to his blade, sparing a couple of peas, but not actually making any move to eat them. He rolls his eyes at Harry, all fond exacerbation.
"And I suppose it hasn't occurred to you to ask yourself what you want to do, has it? Or what you even like to do?"
Harry says, which seems to be answer enough. Draco waves his laden fork in the air a bit. One of the peas flies off into a corner, not that he seems to notice.
"It's honestly a miracle you've survived so many years on this earth. You will be 26 in 1 week, Harry Potter, and yet still, somehow, you know nothing about life."
He smiles, then, a bright one that Harry thinks is vaguely reminiscent of a shark.
"Luckily, you have me. I'm sure that between us we can figure something out. This conversation has taken a terrifying turn," one says in fatalistic tones. "You'll both be dead in a year."
But, well, Harry's just really not that worried about it. They travel for a while. Draco closes the museum for a month and they go. Well, gallivanting around isn't the phrase Harry would use, but it's cropped up in ours from both Hermione and Pansy, so Draco keeps trying to insist that they're taking a grand tour, like the wizards of old, until eventually Harry has to tell him about Dumbledore and Grindelwald's grand tour plans just to get him to shut up about it. It backfires on him, because Draco spends the rest of the trip muttering to himself occasionally about how you still have a responsibility to queer youth, even if your big gay vacation got cancelled by tragedy, but at least he's not proudly announcing them to people as tourists anymore. Some of their stops are work for Draco. He spends 3 days wandering around by himself in Istanbul, another 2 in Prague. He doesn't mind it. It's kind of nice, actually, ducking into shops and chatting pleasantly with locals who either don't know who he is or couldn't give a fuck, eating little meals at random from carts and stands and tiny restaurants. He kind of can't believe that the version of him it brings out, this relaxed, affable person who resembles the man he always hoped he would become, but not in any way Harry really knows how to quantify. Draco rolls his eyes and says Harry'd known a vacation high for what it was if he'd ever behaved like a normal person and taken a vacation before, but Harry thinks he's at least a little bit wrong. Harry thinks that he's just learning how he fits inside of his skin, maybe, if a handful of years later than he was probably supposed to. In Cairo, Pansy takes Draco firmly by the shoulder and insists that Harry fuck off for the day, so Harry shrugs, asks around a little, and then apparates the 10 miles to Giza to see the Great Pyramid. He only means to stop and look at it, the way he's looked at a dozen old houses and caves and weird trees Draco's dragged him to, always with some fabulous, insane story about whatever moved him to bring them there in the first place. It's interesting, certainly, but more because of Draco's story than because of the visits themselves. When he's on his own, Harry prefers his method of sightseeing, which, admittedly, is less about seeing the sights and more about having bizarre conversations with area strangers in magical shops. But still, he's not expecting anything earth-shattering when he apparates to the pyramid. He just wants to have seen it for himself. He ends up staying for hours, the sun beating down hot on his neck, marveling. He's not sure what it is. His father's family was from Egypt before they settled in England generations back, and maybe that's why he's so captivated, why he doesn't even consider walking away. Maybe it's just Harry spent so much of his life hearing, knowing that he was living history, that his very existence was prophesied and foretold to bring down dark evil, that his every action would be studied and judged for years and centuries to come. He went from being a worthless waste of space to the savior of the wizarding world, and one way or another he never got much of a chance to just be Harry, or really even figure out who Harry was. But he stands in front of that pyramid, built by hand all those years ago and standing still, the work of people who stood right here on the same earth that's beneath Harry's feet now, and he feels small. Blissfully, blessedly small. Just one in an endless, ever-expanding line of souls to live and die under the sun. Lovers, failures, heroes, all. Does sunburn actually bliss you out? Draco demands that night, while Harry submits without complaining to being rubbed down with some potion or another. The answer to his question is no, it hurts a lot actually, but there's this unfamiliar sensation in his limbs anyways, and also the rub-down is pretty nice. Oh, I can't believe you're making me do this, by the way. It's grotesque, it's undignified. Oh, I didn't make you do shit, Harry says easily enough. You said, for God's sake, you idiot, you've turned purple. I swear sometimes I could just kill you. And then you insisted. Slander and lies, Draco says, rubbing a particularly painful spot on Harry's neck. The potion helps, and when Harry lets out a little sigh of relief, Draco's voice goes soft. I obviously don't care if you burn yourself to a crisp. Obviously, Harry murmurs and wonders if maybe the sensation in his limbs isn't peace. It's bizarre. He thinks he likes it. They spend a weekend in France with Narcissa Malfoy, and Harry sees what Draco meant about growing up in a museum. He's a different person inside the walls of her beautifully appointed country home, conciliatory and studied in his words and his movements. Careful, in this way, it goes beyond that already painful consideration he brings to most of his life. A dozen times Harry sees him bite back on something he's going to say, cover the impulse with a cough or a yawn, or, a couple of times, a little kick to Harry's ankle. He thinks Narcissa sees it too. Every once in a while, Harry catches her frowning at a smooth mask of Draco's feature, like she's trying to see beneath them, though of course the expression vanishes the moment she notices Harry watching. It's strange. Harry's never really... He doesn't know much about family dynamics at all. About parents, his relationship with his own has obviously been a basically one-sided conversation, barring a year he doesn't remember, and that night in the Forbidden Forest he'll never forget, and otherwise he doesn't have much except the Dursleys and the Weasleys to go off of. Maybe that's why he spent his whole life thinking that family, real family, meant people who knew you backwards and forwards, who listened to you, who loved you regardless of who you were. Even the Dursleys were that way, if only and very exclusively for Dudley. This thing between Draco and his mother is a lot more complicated than that. Harry watches largely in silence as they talk around a dozen topics, their tones always pleasant, even when their eyes are warm or narrowed or hard. Narcissa must offer 100 little comments that seem totally innocuous to Harry but visibly aren't to Draco, and Harry sees Narcissa flinch more than once at something Draco says that sounds perfectly innocent to him. They don't talk about Lucius. The war, Draco's childhood, Harry's presence, the attacks on Grimmauld Place that drew Narcissa to Britain a few months back, the fact that Harry and Draco are sharing a bed. They don't seem to talk about much of anything somehow, despite the fact that at any given moment either Draco or Narcissa is speaking. It makes Harry sad watching it. It's painfully obvious that each of them loves the other, but equally clear that neither one knows how to express that, and that maybe they've never known. Harry puzzles over it for a while, because once you learn to speak his language, Draco's actually a very demonstrative person. He just hides it, often rather sloppily, under a few layers of insults and vitriol, and babbling wildly about something odd. Eventually, Harry concludes that Narcissa doesn't speak Draco's language, and that's about half the problem. The other half is that Draco, afraid of being misunderstood, has more or less stopped speaking it at all. Harry's not really sure how to be helpful. He's not even sure the situation can be helped, so he tries to focus on not being actively unhelpful, which mostly works. They get through Friday and Saturday without any carnage, and after dinner on Sunday, their last night, Narcissa asks Harry to run out and pick up some milk for the tea the following morning. Thinks maybe he's being cleared out to make room for a private conversation, so he takes his time about it, dawdles around in the supermarket, and then just walks for a while through the French countryside. It's a clear night, and on his way back to the house he sees a head of white blonde hair out in one of the wide fields beyond Narcissa's property. Harry veers his path off the road, cutting through tall grass and wildflowers. When he reaches the long wooden fence Draco's leaning against, he leans against it too, places the carton of milk down on the wood between them. Draco gives it a baleful look. "After all this time you were gone, I rather expected a bucket. I assumed you'd found a cow and milked it." "Well, no. In fact, what I assumed is that you found a bull, attempted to milk him, and after resulting head trauma wandered off into the night, never to be seen again." "Out here mourning me, were ye?" Harry says dryly. "Oh, sure," Draco says, shooting him a quicksilver grin that vanishes as rapidly as it appeared. "Mourning, celebrating, whichever you like." Harry makes a rude gesture, then picks off a stalk of tall grass from a nearby cluster and starts picking it apart, one long string at a time. After a moment he says, I thought maybe she wanted to talk to you or something. I didn't want to come back too quickly in case." Draco laughs, brief and bittersweet. "Please, or in Malfoy's, any serious conversation we have goes like this. My mother says, 'Draco, I've made the following unilateral decision,' and I say, 'Perhaps you might have consulted me first,' and she says, 'It's a bit late to worry about that now, isn't it?' And I say, 'Very well.' 2 minutes would have been more than sufficed." He grimaces and adds, "I suppose, technically, that tonight we may have taken up to 5. Occasionally she attempts to deliver a bit of Lucius in absentia, in which case it's the same as before, except at the end there's a nice little addendum warning me not to make a scene featuring an exciting list of highlights from scenes I have made in conversations prior." "You do put on a nice scene," Harry says, because he has to say something, and because he does speak Draco's language, even if that's still a little strange for him, even now. Even if Narcissa doesn't. "Fun and engaging for the whole family. Not to mention anyone lucky enough to be in a 3-mile radius." "Oh, piss off, Potter," Draco says, but he leans a little closer to Harry as he says it, so their arms are pressed together over the bar of the fence. Milk falls over, but Draco doesn't seem to mind. "You're the one to talk." "I'm Harry Potter. All the ill that has ever befallen anyone on the earth is my fault. Over the course of my life I've committed 6 acts of arboreal violence." "We are, thank God, on you right now," Harry says, knocking his shoulder lightly against Draco's without moving his arm away. Draco scowls but says nothing, so Harry carefully asks, "So what, unilateral decision, I guess, did your mom make?" "Oh," Draco says and sighs. The skull drops away from his face, leaves him looking unguarded and young as he stares out into the night. "She's, selling the manor, in fact." "Is that right?" Harry says after a moment's pause. He personally has no love in his heart for that particular property, being as his only memory of it revolves largely around torture, imprisonment, and the heartbreaking sound of Hermione screaming, but they are not on him right now. Sorry?" Draco scoffs. "You're not sorry," he says, and then more quietly, "I'm not sorry. Isn't that horrible? That has endured so much for us in it. I suppose we had a complicated relationship, but it was still my childhood home." "How'd you?" "I have a complicated relationship with the house," Draco says, pointed. "I don't know, Harry. Why don't you tell me?" "That's fair," Harry mutters, though he hates to give up the point. "I don't mean that I'm not sorry," Draco says abrupt, as if Harry hadn't spoken. "Or I shouldn't mean it anyway. About some of it, that house has held generation of Malfoys, you know. It's probably my—" his mouth twists in distaste— "responsibility to talk it out of selling it. To live in it myself, honestly. If I could just keep the grounds, that would be one thing. I'm sorry, truly, about losing those." Keeping to himself, his dawning realization about why Draco seems to find some feature out in nature to lean upon whenever he's experiencing emotion, Harry says, "Draco, you know I'm the last person who would judge you or whatever for not wanting to live somewhere." "Who cares about your judgment?" Draco snaps. "I'm judging me for it. I'd judge someone else if they let their ancestral home get sold off to some unknown third party." Harry rolls his eyes. "Thanks." "Oh, Grimmauld Place wasn't even your ancestral home, you egomaniac," Draco says crossly. "And anyway, I did judge you for that. I still do. Even right now, as we stand here, I think to myself, that man, Draco,
who once threw mud at you and tossed aside your pride and joy for a rank little hovel covered in mould? Him?"
"Glad to see you've worked through the mud incident," Harry says, and laughs a little when Draco elbows him. "What? I'm just saying, that's very mature of you, letting bygones be bygones and all."
"You're a horror,"
Draco mutters, without any real rancour behind it. Then, sounding a little uncertain, he adds,
"Do you know, she didn't even ask me if I wanted it. She said, 'I'm selling it,' and I said, 'What if I don't want you to sell it? What if I buy it from you?' And she said, 'Do what makes you happy, Draco.' Just that."
He laughs, a faint, pained little chuckle that slips away on the wind.
"And the truth is, I honestly don't know if she meant it as a dig or not. I've been standing out here for half an hour thinking about it, and I still don't know. If she meant, 'Do what makes you happy, Draco,' even if that's to live in Grimmauld Place without producing an heir while Malfoy Manor changes hands, ultimately dooming your line and failing your father and I once and for all, as he suspected you would from your first words, well, I suppose I don't necessarily blame her, and I can live with it anyway. I've lived with this long, but if she's genuinely meant she wants me to be happy."
He frowns, looks at his head.
"I'm not sure I know what to do with that, to be entirely honest."
Harry looks at that line of his shoulders, the tension in the set of his mouth, and hates it. He has no idea what to do, so he says what he's thinking, which is, "I don't know if it helps, but, I know that she loves you." He really does, is the thing. He knew it, even before he probably knew Draco. He'll never forget the look on her sister's face that night in the forest, the desperation in her voice when she hissed, "Is Draco alive?" At that time, Harry hadn't entirely been able to square with the idea of anyone loving Draco enough to defy Voldemort for him. An irony that twists his heart a little now, but he still knows it's true, and Draco deserves to know too, if he doesn't.
"Don't be absurd. Of course she does."
Draco spits, proving that he does know and also that Harry's an idiot. He smiles at Harry, though, after a second, something guarded in the expression.
"I even know the story I imagine you were about to tell me, but it should tell you something about our relationship that I didn't hear it from her. I heard it from you, in fact," he says, voice going quiet. "At her trial. We never discussed it afterwards, but in fairness to her, she did make a very significant eye contact with me during your testimony, so I suppose that's something."
He looks so brittle in that moment, lip curled against whatever brutal thought is rattling around inside his head, that Harry itches with the desire to touch him, to offer him some sort of physical something to make up for the words he has no chance of getting right. Which isn't to say that he's likely to get the touching thing right either. He's mostly pretty bad at it, awkward and uncertain, and never quite sure how it's supposed to go. He reaches out anyway, pulls Draco into a rough, graceless hug. It's kind of horrible, at first. Draco's obviously not expecting it, possibly because Harry is inserting a hug where a hug does not belong. He's never quite been able to work out where they go, to be honest. Or possibly because Harry is almost never the one to initiate touch that isn't the sexual kind. He prefers to follow Draco's lead, then takes blind steps in the dark and humiliate himself, which he had done a time or 5 back when he was with Ginny and would like to avoid repeating now. Whatever the reason, Draco doesn't shift in time to keep Harry from essentially knocking Draco's head into his chest, and Harry grimaces at his own ineptitude, wishing briefly but fervently for death. He says, unwilling to let go, because that's when the laughing will start. Of course, then his stupid mouth opens again and produces, "Am I doing this right?" without any input from his damned brain, so the laughing's bound to start in any second now. But Draco surprises him. He stills for a second under Harry's arm, immobile and awkward, in an uncomfortable position, before he twists a little, lines them up. He moves his head to rest on Harry's shoulder, wraps his arm around Harry's waist, and relaxes under Harry's hands when they land, one carefully after the other on his back.
"I'm not sure I'm the authority,"
he says against Harry's collarbone,
"but I'd say 6 out of 10. Room for improvement, but not a terrible showing."
He does laugh a bit when Harry punches out a huge sigh of relief.
"You're pathetic, Potter. Someone could toss you into a death match in a scorpion pit, and you wouldn't bat an eyelash, but this has you shaking in your boots?"
"Yeah, well," Harry says, because it's true. He shrugs just slightly, trying not to jostle Draco's head.
The worst a scorpion can do is sting you. That's, Draco says, sounding horrified. You're so... But he doesn't finish the sentence, and he trucks himself in against Harry a little closer. I don't need you to do this, you know, he adds, not moving away. Oh, of course not. Harry agrees, a little too warmly, but instead of insisting that Harry not humour him, Draco just huffs an irritated little breath against his neck. They stand there like that for a while, and after 15 seconds or so, Harry is even able to shut up the voice in his head, yelling, Step away, it's been too long, you're making it weird. Draco is obviously aware that Harry's got basically no idea what he's doing at all. He'll end it when he wants it to be done. Harry can just stand there and rub his hand up and down the path of Draco's spine and hope it's helping somehow. Feels good at least, on his end. Maybe that's enough. Do you want me to buy the manor and turn it into a museum? Harry says eventually. It's mostly a joke, but there's a horrifying little part of him that's pretty sure he'd do it, actually, if it was what Draco wanted. Draco laughs and finally steps back, looks up at Harry with bright eyes. I don't think that will be necessary, Harry, but thank you. The image of what that place would look like under your care is actually very helpful. At least whoever does buy it won't be you. I'm sure whoever it is will let you visit, Harry says, kindly ignoring the rest of it. Are you? Draco draws, sounding as though he doesn't believe it for a moment. Sure, Harry says, and if they're not, well, I'll come along and you can do that. Look, it's Harry Potter, and I'll do whatever I say to save Britain that you like so much. Maybe you can even bury my body on the lawn, you know, when I die from embarrassment. I do enjoy the opportunity to abuse your celebrity, Draco says, voice thoughtful, since it's so hideously wasted on you and everything. I honestly consider it a public duty. If not I, then who? If not now, then when? See, I mostly get stuck on the why with you, Harry says, and then laughs when Draco gives him a speaking finger and a scowl. They walk back to the house a few minutes later, though they have to double back when they realize they've forgotten about the milk, and Draco grabs Harry by the hand and swings him into a kiss a few minutes before they get to the door. Harry goes along, draws Draco in with arm against the small of his back, and finds himself palming Draco's jaw when they step apart with no real memory of how his hand got there. He thinks he sees another head of blonde hair disappear behind the curtain of the upstairs window, and the next morning, as he and Draco are heading out, Narcissa draws him into a hug of her own. It's both much briefer and considerably less comfortable than Draco's embrace from the night before, especially because of the death grip she has on his upper arm when she whispers, "Take care of my son." Harry doesn't have any interest, now or ever, in telling her that more often than not that particular sentiment works the other way. But he smiles cautiously and nods, and follows Draco out in the morning sunlight, feeling good, he thinks, for being asked. Good to think that she might feel easier for having said it. Good to think that maybe there's something he can do beyond not being actively unhelpful after all. I like helping people, he tells Draco before they apparate. Draco has been needling him since he quit the Auras to come up with things he likes doing, keeping a list of his answers in one of the notebooks he always has hidden away somewhere on his person. And it's hard, honestly, kind of distressingly hard, but Harry's working on it. I like feeling like I did something good for someone. Shocking, Draco says, rolling his eyes, but he writes it down. Their last stop is to New York City, because Draco has a deep and bizarre obsession with the idea of reptilian people living in their sewers. They're like mere people, he tells Harry enthusiastically about 6 minutes after they arrive, only not entirely aquatic, obviously, and of course, I'm sure mere people themselves would object to the comparison. They don't particularly enjoy being associated with anything that doesn't have gills. But apparently, the sewer society is very advanced. They name their young after famous European painters and are strongly committed to the pursuit of enforcement of justice. Draco, Harry says, biting back an absolute scream of laughter with heroic effort. I think you're talking about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Draco narrows his eyes. A ridiculous name for an underground reptilian society. I'm sure that's not what they're really called. It's a mistranslation or something, I'm certain. And if you're about to tell me that they're a muggle myth, I remind you again. No, I know, so are we, but... Harry says rapidly, losing control of his mouth. They're not a myth, they're a cartoon. What's that? A muggle word for urban legend, Draco says, rolling his eyes. You can split all the hairs you like, Potter. I still maintain that the society exists. Well, in that case, Harry says, I think we should get them a pizza. And then gives up and howls with laughter. Doesn't even stop when Draco sighs and grabs his sleeve and starts hauling him forcibly through Central Park. It takes him the better part of 20 minutes for Harry to calm himself down and, slowly and painstakingly, attempt to convince Draco that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are not real beings living in the sewers of New York. Draco's very loath to believe it, and Harry has to pull out the big guns and explain that Dudley had loved them when they were children before I will even grudgingly allow that maybe, possibly, there was also a show about creatures which resembled the justice-minded reptilian society that he still maintains could dwell in the New York City sewer system. You're certifiable, Harry tells him cheerfully as Draco walks sulkily beside him. Where are we going anyway? To find the likeliest-looking manhole cover? Well, now we're not, Draco mutters, and Harry laughs again, hard enough this time that he nearly cries. They end up just walking around for a while. They're bickering about the turtles sliding into the truly hysterical story of how Draco came to believe in a subterranean New York City reptilian society in the first place. It involves 2 chickens, a 13th century cut glass, and a muggle-born teenager who was very clearly just fucking with him for sport, and as Draco tells a story, that fact visibly becomes obvious to him, which just makes it that much funnier. By the time he's done, Harry's wiping actual tears of laughter from his face, and Draco's hunched a little, hands in his pockets, vibrating with impotent rage. Yes, Potter, he says, sounding equal parts enraged and mortified. Yes, I spent believing that, talking to people about it. Oh, I could just die. I swear on all that is holy, should I ever run across that ingrate child again, I'll send him to live in the sewers. He shudders slightly. It'll be no more than he deserves too. Filthy places, sewers. Harry agrees, but then he remembers that his only real experience in a sewer involved a basilisk and Tom Riddle, and Draco had very empathetically not been present. Which Harry thinks now is kind of a pity, because probably if he and Draco hadn't been at each other's throats every second of the day back then, they could have solved that whole thing much earlier. He sort of can't imagine a version of events where that situation could have baffled both Draco and Hermione for so long. Still, wait, Harry says, laughter already bubbling up in his voice again. Have you gone looking before? I'm going to get ice cream, Draco says, a little too loud, cheeks pinking as he hurries off towards a cart in the distance, which means yes, and also that this is the best day of Harry's life. Harry laughs to himself as Draco stalks off, delighted by this entire ridiculous turn of events, and sees a tent and some people a little ways away. Curious, he walks over and finds a pet adoption fair, dogs and cats in cages, a couple of volunteers chatting to people milling around. Harry smiles vaguely at a little girl playing with a small, enthusiastic puppy, and then finds himself drawn to a cage down at the end of the group, with no people nearby. Inside is a blue pit bull, maybe 6 months old, and too skinny, with one eye missing, an angry, fresh-looking scar stretched across the place where it should have gone. He growls at Harry from the corner of his cage, the sound coming harsh from the back of his throat. Huh? Harry says, tilting his head. After a second, he crouches in front of the cage, drops his eyes to the ground, and says, voice low, I'm not pitying you, if that's what you think. I bet whatever happened wasn't even your fault, and I'm sure you did the best you could. I've got a couple of scars too, see? He holds out his right hand, where the words, I must not tell lies, will be written every day for the rest of his damn life, and watches the dog from underneath his lashes. Warily, growl abandoned, the creature creeps forward a few steps in the cage and sniffs at Harry's hand for a moment before, hastily, he retreats again. Harry bites down on a smile. Well, that's okay. I get it. Constant vigilance, am I right? The dog cocks his head at him. Harry cocks his head back, and is rewarded with a second worth of a tongue-lolling grin before someone says, Wow, he really likes you. Harry looks up to see a teenage volunteer beaming at him. He gives the dog a betrayed look, ashamed to have been caught out talking to him like a person. The dog seems unperturbed.
Harry says with an awkward little shrug, and wonders if he's supposed to stand up from his crouch or not.
I don't know about all that. I'm sure he's just bored or something.
No, I really mean it,
the volunteer gushes.
He's been out at 3 of these events now, and he always scares people. He's a really great dog,
she adds quickly, looking horrified with herself.
I mean, I've worked with him at the shelter. I shouldn't have said, he's wonderful. He really deserves to get adopted. Just doesn't like being in a cage.
Who does? Harry says, shooting the dog a commiserating look. Draco returns as she walks away, and Harry does get up from his crouch. It's too late, though, because Draco raises his eyebrows and says,
Potter, oh my god, absolutely not.
Did you actually not get me any ice cream? Harry says, staring at the lone cone in Draco's hand, and Draco smirks, momentarily distracted.
You didn't say you wanted one,
he says, all feigned innocence, widening his eyes and blinking quickly.
And of course I'd share, but Potter...
This last squawks probably because Harry has just stuck his finger in the side of his ice cream and scooped out a little section for himself. Harry licks about half of it clean, returning Draco's feigned innocent look and enjoying the way Draco's gaze keeps flicking down to Harry's mouth, as if he is trying to fight the urge to openly stare. Then Harry crouches down, ignoring Draco's despairing groan, and sticks his finger into the cage with the pit bull. Again, the dog approaches warily, but this time when he sniffs Harry's hand, his tail starts to wag, and he licks the ice cream off at once.
I can't believe I left you alone for 5 minutes and this is what happened, Draco says, clearly more to himself than to Harry. I can't believe you stuck your finger in my ice cream. I'd honestly be better off travelling with a toddler.
He's always like this,
Harry tells the dog, who is watching Draco with interest now, possibly because he's the one holding the rest of the ice cream.
It's not you. Harry, you are not adopting this dog, Draco says urgently. You are barely capable of keeping yourself alive, let alone another living being. I urge you, I implore you, stop speaking to him like a person. In fact, come away at once. You are clearly already dangerously attached, and in another 30 seconds, even I won't be able to keep you from doing something reckless and rash.
Bye, buddy,
Harry says to the dog, as Draco grabs his arm to pull him up. He's a little regretful, but Draco's probably right. He is, after all, unemployed, with absolutely no idea as to what his future work schedule will look like in a city across an ocean from his own. Probably not a responsible time to become a pet owner. And that would be the end of it, except that as they are walking away, this totally random white guy in a Rush t-shirt nods to Draco and says,
Making the right call there, my friend. Pardon me?
Says Draco, lip curling a little.
But I don't believe we met, so tell me. I care about your opinion because... why now?
The guy shrugs, not seeming at all bothered by Draco's knee-jerk hostility.
Maybe you don't. I was just saying it's the right call. Not taking that one home. The dangerous pit bulls, it's down to the breeding. Not one of them that doesn't go bad in the end.
Is that right? Draco drawls. His voice is like ice cream, and the guy must pick up on this time, because he hurries off pretty sharpish. Draco stares after him a second, and then looks back at the cage where the dog's still looking up at them, and then snaps,
Oh, come on!
And starts walking away again, clearly expecting Harry to follow. Harry does follow. After a few steps, Draco says, sharp and interrogatory,
What would you even do with a dog?
I don't really know, Harry admits. I've never had one before. I always kind of wanted one as a kid, but obviously that never happened. Well, unless you count Sirius as Animagus form. Harry smiles a little to think of Petford's ache in his chest be damned.
Well, I don't really... It wasn't quite the same, I don't think.
Considers Draco's question for a moment.
I take him on long walks, I suppose. Runs, too. Teach him tricks and things, you know, dog stuff.
Draco groans. A heartfelt noise from the back of his throat.
What?
Harry says, a little stung. He did not, after all, say,
Make him my best friend and listen to me and go on adventures and bite my cousin on the bum,
which is why he'd wanted one when he was 9.
That's what you do with dogs. No, I was just thinking,
Draco says, and there's a slight pause before he finishes,
that we should probably settle in, is all. I'm famished. You go find us a restaurant. I'll track down lodgings and we'll meet back here in, 20 minutes?
Sure, Harry says, bemused, as Draco walks off as to how he could be famished whilst currently eating an ice cream cone. He's a lot less bemused when 20 minutes later he returns to the spot they agreed upon only to see a sheepish Draco, leash in hand, standing next to the one-eyed dog.
Really great job keeping me from doing anything rash or reckless, Dad Draco,
Harry says, looking back and forth between them with wide eyes.
Draco scowls. You stupid Gryffindor, Roger's contagious,
he mutters, thrusting the leash at Harry.
And this is your fault, so he's your dog.
Harry could argue, but he doesn't really want to, so he takes the leash instead. The dog looks up at him with a curious eye. As promised, he seems infinitely happier outside of his cage.
You'll need a name,
Harry tells him seriously, and he wafts out a cheerful-sounding breath, wags his tail.
I am consumed by immediate regret,
Draco says, looking despairingly between the both of them.
How do you Gryffindors live like this?
But he moves up their portkey home to the end of the afternoon, so Harry doesn't think he means it all that much. The name thing turns out to be a point of contention, because even though Draco insists that it's Harry's dog to do with what he likes, he demands to have a say. Harry wants Cyclops for obvious reasons. Draco rejects this out of hand and suggests Bartholomew, which Harry hates.
What about Alistair?
He says, still on the one-eyed thing.
Absolutely not,
Draco gasps, putting a hand to his heart and pulling a face of deep betrayal.
I know he's your great shining hero of never relaxing a minute in your life, but that man turned me into a ferret, Potter, a ferret, and bounced me around on the stone floors. It took me days to physically recover, and psychologically I still haven't. I've had to refuse to name an animal after him.
That wasn't even Mad-Eye, though, Harry says, even though he knows it's a losing battle. Mad-Eye was locked in a trunk for polyjuice ingredients when that happened. Your issue was with a different man who, he adds, delighted to realize, actually might as well have been named Bartholomew, so...
I hate you,
Draco says, and then looks at the dog and adds,
and also you, both of you, obviously him,
he gestures at Harry,
a little more, but you are a terror in your own right, and I wouldn't doubt for a second that you used some kind of canine trickery to secure your adoption in the first place.
The dog cocks his head at Draco, then looks at Harry, who shrugs.
Don't look at me, mate. I warned you. He gets like this. Don't talk to him like he's a person,
Draco insists for the 100th time already, either not noticing or not deigning to care that he's just done the same thing himself. For fraught week, the dog has no name and wreaks havoc while Harry's learning up on how to train him, peeing everywhere and knocking things down. Eats the bottom of a set of curtains that Draco claims were treasured heirlooms, although he doesn't mention whose heirloom, and he never seemed to like them much before. Still, every time he comes across a new canine-adjacent affront, Draco yells, "Potter!" And there's a day or two where Harry is genuinely afraid that the dog is going to start answering to it and doom him to a lifetime of shame. Luckily, Rose sorts it out for them after a fashion. She's toddling around on the foot that Wednesday night while Harry cooks dinner, and Harry keeps forgetting how fast she's gotten. He looks around after just 2 seconds of concentration on his gazpacho, and she's gone. He hurries off to look for her, calling her name.
"What, did you lose her?"
Ron demands, sticking his head out of the parlor. He doesn't sound that worried, probably because Rose has, Harry knows, outfoxed him several times as well.
"Well, mindy, Harry lost our baby."
"The baby escaped him with intent, you mean?" Hermione says, as she and Draco step out in the hall after him. "I swear, ever since she learned to walk, Rosie!
Tama!
Comes back to them, and Rose is gleefully still developing toddler voice. It seems to be coming from the drawing room, and as they all move to follow the sound of her voice, Ron says,
"Funny that. That's what she calls tomatoes."
"Oh, God," Harry says, understanding dawning horribly as he steps through the door. Rose is standing in the center of the room, clapping her hands in delight across from the dog, who is gleefully holding between his teeth the sack which Harry has enchanted to follow him around and catch scraps while he cooks, which tonight is almost entirely full of chunks of tomatoes.
"Oh my God,"
Draco says in kind of a restrained shriek. He elbows his way up to stand next to Harry, ignoring Ron and Hermione's respective objection.
"Potter, so help me, if a single exhibit in this room gets damaged, I will ruin you. Do you understand me? I will ruin your life."
"Easy," Harry says, not sure if he's talking to Draco or the dog. He steps towards the center of the room, one hand reaching out slowly towards the sack of scraps. "Hey, boy, why don't you just let me—" Even as the dog starts to tilt his head, every adult in the room is moving. Ron, Harry, and Hermione, and Draco all draw their wands. Protego! Presumably the rest of them are casting it on themselves. Harry, in the interest of not forcing Draco to choose between going back on his word and ruining his life, casts it around the exhibit cases and walls, resigned to his fate. The ensuing catastrophe only takes a few seconds to play out. The dog gleefully shakes the sack between his teeth, and it bursts, as it was always going to, spattering Harry with tomatoes and basil stems and garlic husks and all the other detritus he's shoved in there tonight. He sighs, reaches up to wipe his eyes, and then realizes that while the exhibits, Ron, Hermione, and Rose are all perfectly clean, Draco looks exactly like Harry must. He casts his protection spell the way Harry did, Harry realizes, seeing the same knowledge dawn on Draco's face. God, he looks a mess. Tomato bits in his hair and something brown, probably the balsamic vinegar Harry spilled, dripping down his neck onto his starched white shirt. His face is already twisting with some histrionic expression, or of fury, or both, that is especially ridiculous, and underneathing its coating of kitchen garbage, and honestly a bit pinful for Harry, because he loves the bastard a truly wretched amount. Harry can't help himself. He starts to laugh. It takes a second, but then Draco's laughing too, hard enough and long enough that he has to reach out and grab Harry's arm for support. Harry lets him, and for a minute they just stand there, leaning on each other, cracking up, because they're idiots. Because, really, it's pretty funny.
Tama!
Rose declares, and toddlers forward to give the dog a hug around the neck. He offers Harry a tongue-lolling grin over Rose's shoulder, not an ounce of shame in him, and Harry can't help but grin back at his sheer good-natured audacity, the way he just has to make things difficult. The floors take forever to clean, and Harry's sure that one rug didn't have those little red spots on it before, but the dog's tomato after that. Tomo, for short. And it's weird, Harry gets up in the morning, the same time every morning, and takes the dog for a run. He gets home in time to sneak in a shower before Draco wakes up, and then cooks breakfast and takes it up to the sitting room, where Draco's still doing his own little morning routine, consistent as breathing, unchanged by all the changes that's been wrought around it. They eat, and Draco tells Harry what was in the papers, and sneakily feeds the dog something off the plate, only to voraciously deny having done so. Then he goes to open a museum, or go to a meeting, or host a talk, or whatever else, and Harry is at loose end in his own city for kind of the first time in his life. That's not true, of course. He had time to spare, and embarrassment of it for years and years, but somehow he never went out and did anything with it. Somehow it felt like it didn't belong to him. At first he was so heavy with the weight of what he'd been through, what he'd lost, that he could barely function. Then, for a long time, he drew in guilt with every breath, knowing in his bones that it was unfair that he'd lived and they had died. He was a void those first few years, just a black hole doing its impression of a star. And when that finally started to shrink down, when he finally started to feel as though there was something other than emptiness inside of him, well, when that happened, Harry was so grateful that he didn't notice, didn't care, that what came back wasn't as much or something as what had been there before. Harry hadn't bothered to wonder if less empty was the same as full. It wasn't, he understands now. He thinks he's probably still, that there's probably always going to be a pocket of emptiness he carries beneath his skin, the way he once carried a corner of a toxic soul. Probably never going to be full, not the way people like Ron and Hermione are full, and that's all right. He can get close, like Draco's clothes, and tuck that pocket of emptiness in with all his other scars. Harry takes Tomato on long walks through the city. Harry takes himself on long walks through the city, wandering into and out of whatever random shops and structures strike his fancy. He even finds himself walking diagonally now and again, something he hasn't done since he was at Hogwarts. For the last 7.5 years, he's apparated straight to his destination any time he had to diagon, even though he lived right up the street and was always filled with dread that someone would try to talk to him. But Harry wants to show Tomato the Owl Emporium slowly, walking by it a few times so he can get comfortable with the smell of a bunch of birds and maybe stop being so freaked out by Mathilda and Draco's owl Antigone. Harry wants to get an ice cream at Fortescue and feed Tomato little bites of it when he does a trick right. Harry wants to get to know Diagon, his very own wizarding district, the way he started to know the wizarding districts in Istanbul and Prague after only a few days, so he goes sometimes. People do try to talk to him, almost always, but it's a lot easier with Tomu than it was without. Harry can redirect the attention to the dog, who actually appreciates it, then use him as an excuse to be getting on with his day. In Magalondon, he has to put a disillusioned charm on Tomato sometimes, but to his surprise, in a lot of places he doesn't. He notes those businesses, keeps going back, and one Saturday morning he's showing Draco this incredible little shop where a woman and her husband carve sculptures out of pine cones, and a little girl, maybe 11 or 12, walks up to him and says,
"Your dog is cute. Is it okay if I pet him, or is he working? I don't mean to bother you if he's a service dog."
"Potter,"
Draco says, sounding intrigued.
"Did you get the dog a job here? You do understand that you are the one of the two of you who is eventually expected to acquire one of those, yes? Dashed enterprising of you, of course."
He adds to Tomato,
"Perhaps we can use your wages to pay for all the damage you've caused to my home."
"Tomato and I remain unemployed," Harry says, rolling his eyes, but grinning slightly. To the girl, who is still hovering patiently and exchanging barely restrained looks of eagerness with Tomo, he says, "Sure you can pet him. What's a service dog?" The girl immediately drops to her knees and gives a thrilled Tomato a vigorous scritch behind the ears.
"Oh, you know, they help people with, illnesses and stuff."
She frowns, considering.
"I think lots of different kinds. My Aunt Angeli has one for her nerves. She says it's much easier to get out of the house when Wilbur helps."
"Does she now?" Draco says, a speculative look in his eyes. Harry hurries them out of the shop quickly before he can do anything mad, because he's learned about that look the hard way a time or two by now. Draco doesn't do anything mad, though. Just tucks his arm through Harry's and takes Tomo's leash, and voice carefully light says, "I truly can't believe the dog's more employed than you are."
"Oh, bite me,"
Harry says, but he doesn't argue. He figures, well, Tomo does make it easier to get out of the house, doesn't he? Not that Harry has nerves or whatever Aunt Angeli's got. Still, though, the dog helps. Having him around makes it easier for Harry to live his life. He doesn't need Draco's oblique references, let alone the self-satisfied nudging and muttering, to tell him that much. To be continued. Thank you for listening to this part of the epilogue of What We Pretend We Can't See by gyzym. As you can hear, this epilogue is pretty long. We are about halfway through, so I decided to split it into 2 parts. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on Spotify, YouTube, or AO3.